why is it that these reductive, inadequate, manifestly ahistorical, irrational, utterly, low-grade kinds of analysis have become so dominant? And I think if we can't answer that question, it is difficult to transcend their hold on those who ascribe to them.
Well, you said that the woke phenomena is an index of the vast longing/hunger of our moment. I mean, the other thing, one of the other things that Rossi said that was quite interesting was that when the new doctrines entered the private school that he was teaching, he was initially highly supportive of them because they came in flying, let's say, the anti-racist flag. And like, who isn't happy about anti-racism? And so if you take it at face value, well, then you get to put yourself on the side of the heroes that are fighting against those who oppress people on the basis of arbitrary characteristics like their race. And so that certainly accounts for some of the attraction on the positive side. I mean, the negative side is, well, the opportunity to tear things down for the sake of tearing them down in the name of some higher moral virtue that just covers the real motivation, which is to tear things down because you're envious. But, to give the devil his due, well, there's something to be said for identifying with a movement that purports to be serving the interests of the poor and the dispossessed and those who are prejudiced against, and to take to task those who are perpetrators of such things. And so I see that as part of a religious impulse to do the good, but it's so incomplete, and it's so dangerous in its incompleteness because, well, partly because it provides a too convenient enemy, and partly because it does dispense with the richness of the past. And and then it brings with it in its wake, let's say, all sorts of ideas that are entirely counterproductive. It contains within it a fundamental critique of the idea of free market economies, for example, which to me is just a disaster. Just from a computational perspective, we can't do with central planning what the market can do with computation because it's distributed and it relies on the choices of everyone. It's a much more effective computational system, but we seem to have done a pretty bad job of defending it.
Well, I think that's a very, very good statement of the problem. Why is that so? I mean, well, let's say a few things. The first is that I do think the whole woke thing, which, for whatever, whether that, what that word even means is, I think it is a good question to dig into fairly carefully. But I think it is an index of a search for meaning in a deep sense, at least for many. Of course, there are many people who just cynically take things up. They know it's a power move. It's a power political move. They know what they're doing full well. It's wrong. It's reductive. It destroys people's lives. We know that's what's at work. There are always people who will do this. But in a much larger sense, I don't think that's an adequate analysis. I think that at a larger level, it is an index for a search for meaning. And we, I think, need to remember Aristotle's fundamental insight into the human psyche, which is that, one is only ever moved by some kind of a perceived good. That's why for Dante, you go down to the bottom of hell, which is just an allegory for him about this life, not a vision of the afterlife. Things are frozen. There's no movement at all because the good of intellect, or even any perceived good, however limitedly or obscurely perceived, is gone. It's just frozen. And so whenever there's any action at all, it's because there's some kind of a perceived good at work, even if that is completely misperceived. I'm saying it's a perceived good. We never do anything at all. You don't go up to make yourself a sandwich or go get the mail or say hello to anyone without some kind of a perceived good. So the second thing I would say is that I think we need to think of times when there is a significant, therefore, we need to think about times when there is a significant amount of momentum behind something. It could be National Socialism in the 20s and 30s in Germany. It could be the movement to Scottish independence in our own day. It could be the so-called woke movement, Black Lives Matter, whatever lens we want to look at this from. We need to really honestly ask ourselves the question: what is moving in this? And I think it's clearly the case that from what I understand about the formation of the complicated historical movements that led to the Second World War, that there was in Germany, at least I would be very surprised to learn this is not the case, a vulnerability to an ideological standpoint that gave a defining collective purpose. And that seems to me to indicate a lack of that not being done in a better way. You could say the same thing, I suspect, about Scottish independence. Is it really that Scottish independence, or is it that...
Well, if you were in Canada, in Quebec, and you were a lapsed Catholic, a French lapsed Catholic, you were 4 times as likely to be a separatist during the separatist uprising, say in the 1980s and 1990s in Canada, or 1960s through the 1990s. The Gallup poll indicated that. And so, Quebec was the last place in Western Europe, in some sense, that, so to speak, where Catholicism dissolved. And that didn't happen until the late 1950s. And it was instantly replaced by a radical nationalism, which really, I watched it from the outside. I was in Quebec for much of that. It was impenetrable. You could see that it was a displaced religious doctrine. The state had taken the place of Christ. That's the simplest way of putting it.
Well, that's a great historical example. I think that at a minimum, what many people perceive in these sort of so-called woke movements is at least some incipient or inchoate vision of justice, that the least of these among us matters. The different among us matters. Now, of course, I think that the standpoint that is through which these things are viewed is completely tragic and unfulfillable, unable to fulfill the very ends that it seeks to bring about. But the conservatives and free market lovers and all these people very often lament the fact. They say, why is it that this, we call it the left, call it whatever you want, seems to beat us on the moral argument every time, despite the fact that we know that our systems and the ideas that we espouse historically have been shown to be superior to the very values that the so-called left is beating us at. And I think that this does raise the fact that I've been reading Tupi's wonderful coffee table book. I know you had a wonderful conversation with him recently about how much better everything is getting
in absolute terms. Yeah,
in absolute terms. And this is a wonderful. It's a very important book. These are wonderful achievements. We should all rejoice and absolutely face them and be glad for them and the things that they will make possible. But it is also very interesting to note what is not in Tupi. There's no talk about beauty. There's no talk about architecture. There's no talk about cultural achievement. There's no talk about, let's put it this way, there is no talk about many of the things that are most fundamental to the meaning in human life. And that's not to degrade or denigrate the achievements that are being spoken about there, but it is rather to say that if your metric for human flourishing is, do we have enough to eat, and are we not getting rained on? And you go through these lists of kind of fundamentally material things, all of which are fundamentally important, and not only because they're material, because there's also a spiritual dimension to those things for human beings. But the point I'm making is that
you see the same thing in Steven Pinker's work, like The Blank Slate. I hope I've got this right, because I've read a couple of Pinker's books. But one of the things, so he thinks very much like Tupi thinks, and he wrote the Better Angels of Our Nature, if I remember correctly, as well, showing that human aggression has decreased substantially over the last number of centuries. But all of the qualities of humanity that you describe are they're parsed off near the end of the book into a single chapter, as if they're just secondary side effects of some more profound rationality, let's say. And it's the rationality that's concentrating on material well-being. And I don't have anything against material well-being and the elimination of privation, but there is, and it's interesting that you make that comment about Tupy's work, is that the spiritual dimension, it's like the list of what should be attended to have a meaningful life that I listed at the beginning of our talk. At the end, I capped that off with some attention to be paid for the spiritual or moral or religious element of life to bring everything together. And that narrow focus on material well-being, necessary though it is, does seem to lack there's something in it that's missing that's absolutely fundamental, that if it's missing, undermines the whole project, or appears to.
Well, I think the bottom line is that there is no deep human realization for any individual outside of understanding her or himself in relation to higher order principles, truths, realities. I mean, that's just what human beings are. So that is not to denigrate the necessity of improvement in all these areas that Tupy so brilliantly chronicles. I don't portray myself as somehow anti-Tupy. I'm a huge fan of this. I'm a huge fan of the inclusive institutions that they describe as necessary to human flourishing. But I think it needs to be said that in the most developed places, so-called developed places of the world, skepticism about those inclusive institutions is higher than anywhere else, or at least arguably so. I think it needs to be said that there's nothing in the book about the very disturbing trends of rising suicide, of rising of dopamine addiction, of porn addiction in young men, of course, especially. These are, and I think it needs to be said that many of these things that appear to be a very fundamental malaise of contemporary life are also related to technology. And one of the paradoxes, I think, that I love to ask you about, Jordan, relative to your own work on the individual and human individual realization, is that if on the one hand, human beings are becoming increasingly liberated from, the demands of material necessity. I mean, the amount of time it took they bring up brilliantly, to create light, for example, was an immense amount of work, or to save up enough calories to make it through a winter. All of these, just the bone-grindingly hard aspect of human existence for millennia. Then we are very rapidly in the last 2 centuries, now almost every human being in the planet, not everyone, but the vast majority, are living at standards of living that were inconceivable by anyone just a few centuries ago. So these are amazing achievements. But it also needs to be said that insofar as, if on the one hand, the individual is being liberated from those bone-crushing realities, at the same time, it does appear to be a key aspect of modern life that individuals are finding themselves less connected, more alienated, and that the very technology, in some respects, that liberates them also appears to homogenize in a kind of globally reductive way, such that, as human life is lived on the ground, the frame in which it's actually lived and in which meaning is derived, that has become more distant, harder to access, and that we have far fewer of the tools we might have once had to make sense of that all-important sphere.
I've talked to Bjorn Lomborg and to Matt Ridley and to Marian Tupy and to other people who are deeply concerned about continuing to make absolute privation, let's say, a thing of the past, and to many people as well who are hoping to ameliorate relative privation, which is more the concern of the left, as you already pointed out. And all of these people are also aware, and Stephen Fry, for that matter. Stephen has allied himself to some degree with the four horsemen of the atheist world and is a dramatist, and so understands, at least in his bones, the necessity of this underlying poetic, dramatic, religious, humanistic matrix out of which rationality has emerged and in which rationality must remain embedded. I mean, what it looks like to me is that, and I see this dawning realization among people like Richard Dawkins as well, at least by proxy, talking to people who know him and watching what's happened to him with the humanists, for example, who attacked him, is that this insistence on pure rationality and pure Enlightenment rationality doesn't address the fundamental religious impulse. And the hope was among the four horsemen of the atheist world, let's say, that once we dispensed with this irrational superstition, we'd all become materialist rationalists, of the intellectual caliber of Steven Pinker. But that isn't what's happening. I don't believe that that can be the case. What happens instead is that all sorts of things that religion should be separated from, the higher life, the spiritual life, the religious life, all of that falls down a level or two, and pure politics becomes contaminated with the religious impulse. And then it becomes totalizing. And that looks like a catastrophe. And so it seems to me that we need to pull up the spiritual domain again, to parse it off as a separate field of what? Endeavor, study, hope, to give it its due. And that's the role, at least in part, that the universities should be playing. Instead, they're tearing things down.